The wall of dust came out of the northeast like the end of the world, and Susanna Gentry saw it swallow the ridge above her homestead before she heard it. She dropped the fence post she had been setting and ran for the corral, shouting for the 2 horses that belonged to her, and for a third one, a rangy bay gelding tied loose to her porch rail, that did not. "Get inside," she called toward the house, though there was no one inside to hear her, only habit talking, only the ghost of 2 years of talking to a husband who no longer answered. She caught the bay's lead rope herself, because whoever had ridden it up to her door in the last 10 minutes had apparently gone around back of the barn and not come out again, and dust storms did not wait on manners. The rider came around the corner of the barn at a dead run, hatless, one hand pressed to a bloodied shoulder, and she had half a second to register that he was tall, sun-marked, maybe 30, and moving like a man who had trained his body to keep working even when it wanted to quit. "Ma'am, I am sorry to trespass," he shouted over the rising wind, "but I need your barn in about 4 minutes." "You can have both," she shouted back, "but the horses come first." That was the answer that made Elias Archer decide, even with a bullet furrow scored along his shoulder and the sky turning the color of a bruise, that he liked this woman. They worked without further words, because words were being stolen by the wind. Susanna took the bay by the halter and half dragged, half coaxed him into the low barn, and Elias got the barn door swung wide enough for his own horse, and then wide enough for her too, and between them they had all 3 animals inside, and the door dropped and barred just as the front edge of the dust storm hit the walls like a fist. The barn groaned. Dust sifted between the planks in fine gray ribbons, gold in the one shaft of light still finding its way through a knothole. The horses stamped and blew and pressed themselves into the corners, and Susanna Gentry stood with her back against a support post, breathing hard, staring at the stranger who had brought trouble to her door in more ways than the weather. "You are bleeding on my hay," she said. "I noticed that myself," Elias answered, and managed something like a smile despite the gray pallor under his tan. "Name is Elias Archer. I am obliged to you, and I promise I did not bring this storm with me on purpose." "Susanna Gentry," she said, "and I did not think you had." "Sit down before you fall down, Mr. Archer, and let me look at that shoulder." He sat, because there did not seem to be much use arguing with a woman who was already tearing a strip from the hem of her own petticoat to use as a bandage, her hands quick and unhesitating in a way that told him she had done this before, on this land, alone. Outside, the wind screamed against the boards, and inside the barn the light went the color of an old bruise, and Susanna Gentry pressed a folded cloth against a stranger's shoulder, and did not yet know that within 3 weeks she would need him to keep her alive, and he did not yet know that within 3 weeks he would decide, for the first time in 11 years of hard riding between mining camps and mountain towns, that he wanted to stop. The year was 1881, and the town nearest to Susanna Gentry's homestead was called Larkspur, a silver camp that had gone from 4 tents to 400 souls in under 2 years, spilling down a narrow Colorado valley below the Sawatch Range, with more ambition than lumber to build it properly. Larkspur had 1 assay office, 1 bank that was really just a strongbox behind a counter, 1 church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, 2 saloons, and exactly 1 doctor. And that doctor was riding a wide circuit that took him from Larkspur to 3 smaller camps and back again on a rotation that left him sleeping in his saddle more nights than he liked to admit. Elias Archer had trained in Philadelphia, had come west after the war looking for open country and a slower kind of grief, and had discovered instead that a man with medical training in the high mountains of Colorado did not get to grieve slowly. He got to ride. He rode to broken legs in mining shafts, to fevers in miners' shanties, to childbirths in cabins with no midwife for 40 miles. And in 11 years, he had buried more patients than he liked to remember, and saved enough of them that the camps between Larkspur and Gunnison had come to think of him the way they thought of weather, as a force that arrived when needed and could not be relied upon to stay. He had been riding from Larkspur toward the Anderson claim when 3 men had jumped him on the trail, not for money, since he carried little, but because he had been seen leaving the office of the county recorder in Larkspur 2 days before, and word had gotten around that Dr. Archer had been asked to witness a piece of testimony that certain men would rather see disappear. The bullet that grazed his shoulder had been meant to do worse. He had put his horse over a deadfall that the men chasing him had not dared to try, and come out the other side alone, and ridden hard until the storm caught him, and the nearest shelter turned out to be a homestead, with a woman standing outside setting fence posts like the end of the world was not, in fact, currently arriving. He did not tell Susanna Gentry all of that in the barn. He told her only that he had taken a fall and a scrape, because a man did not frighten a woman who had just saved his horses with the truth about armed riders on her land, not until he understood how much danger might still be walking behind him. But Susanna Gentry, cleaning a bullet furrow with more competence than a fall from a horse ought to require, was already forming her own private suspicions, and she kept them to herself the way she kept most things, tucked behind steady hands and a face that did not give much away. The storm blew itself out after 2 hours, leaving the yard buried under drifts of fine gray dust like dirty snow, and Susanna's little house looking as though it had aged 10 years in an afternoon. She fed Elias Archer beans and cornbread at her kitchen table, under a lamp she lit early because the dust had turned the whole sky the color of dusk, long before the sun was actually gone. "You are the doctor," she said, not a question. "Dr. Archer. I have heard your name. Mrs. Kellerman's boy broke his arm falling out of the hay loft last spring, and you said it. I remember the boy, ornery patient, bit me. He bites everyone. It is a family trait." She set a second cup of coffee in front of him, poured strong enough to stand a spoon in, and sat across from him with her own cup held in both hands like she needed the warmth more than the drink. "I am surprised a fall from a horse cut you up that clean along one line like that, Dr. Archer. I have set enough fence wire and skinned enough game to know what a bullet furrow looks like when I am cleaning it." He looked at her for a long moment, weighing how much a stranger deserved to know, and decided that a woman sharp enough to see through his lie deserved better than a second one. "You are right," he admitted. 3 men came at me on the trail from Larkspur. I do not know exactly why, though I have a guess, and my guess does not comfort me much." "What is your guess?" "There is a piece of trouble happening at the Larkspur assay office and the county recorder's desk, over claims and deeds that got recorded wrong, or recorded right but by the wrong hands, depending on who you ask. I was asked 2 days back to witness a statement for a woman with a grievance against a man named Roy Castellan, who has more silver money in Larkspur than any 3 other men put together, and less patience for being questioned than any 3 men put together besides. I signed as a witness. I did not think anyone would care that much." Susanna Gentry's cup went very still against the table. "Roy Castellan," she repeated, and something in her voice had gone careful, deliberate, like a woman stepping onto ice she was testing for thickness. "You know him." "I know him the way most folks in this valley know a rattlesnake, by reputation and by giving him plenty of room." She set the cup down. "What was the grievance, Dr. Archer, if you are able to say?" He studied her face in the lamplight before he answered, and something in the way she held herself, waiting, made him decide this was not idle curiosity. "A woman named Ruth Halloran claims Castellan's foreman forged her late husband's signature on a deed transfer, handing over a mining claim worth considerable money, 3 weeks after the husband was already dead and unable to sign anything at all. She came to Larkspur to file a complaint and asked me, since I had treated her for a fever the week before, and she trusted me some, to witness that her statement to the recorder was made of her own free will and sound mind." Susanna Gentry was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had died to nothing, and the silence of the settling dust felt enormous. "My husband is dead too, Dr. Archer," she said finally. "Nathaniel Gentry, 2 years this coming spring. And the deed to this homestead, the one we built together with our own hands, 4 years of clearing rock and hauling timber, was never properly recorded in my name because when Nathaniel filed it, the recorder's office listed it under his name alone, the way they mostly do out here, husband and wife not being equal in the law's eyes, even when they built a thing with 2 sets of hands instead of one. I have been trying for a year to get that deed corrected, to get my name onto the paper that says this land is mine, and every time I go to Larkspur I am told the recorder is unavailable, or the fee has changed, or the paperwork has been misplaced. And 3 months ago, a man came to my door with a piece of paper claiming Nathaniel sold this land to Roy Castellan's mining company for a debt I never knew existed, 6 months before Nathaniel died, and I told that man to get off my land before I put a rifle ball through his hat. Elias Archer set down his coffee slowly. You think Castellan is trying to take your homestead? I know he is trying to take my homestead. There is silver under that eastern ridge, Dr. Archer. I have seen the color in the creek gravel myself, and Roy Castellan does not care whose grave he has to walk over to get to it. I have no proof of the forgery beyond my own certainty that my husband never signed any such thing, because Nathaniel was laid up in bed those last 6 months with the consumption that killed him and could barely hold a spoon, let alone a pen. But certainty is not proof, and Roy Castellan has lawyers in Denver and I have a rifle and a stubborn streak. The lamp flickered between them. Elias Archer felt something shift in his chest, an old, familiar tightening that had nothing to do with the ache in his shoulder, the recognition of a fight he had just, entirely by accident, ridden straight into the middle of. Mrs. Gentry, he said slowly, I think you and Ruth Halloran may be fighting the same man for the same reason, and I think that is not a coincidence Roy Castellan would be comfortable with either of us knowing. Susanna Gentry looked at him across the lamplit table, this stranger with a bullet wound in his shoulder, who had ridden the storm straight to her door, and felt the peculiar vertigo of a woman realizing that her lonely, private war had just acquired an ally she had not asked for and did not entirely know how to want. Then I suppose, she said, you had better stay the night, Dr. Archer, since I doubt those 3 men have given up looking for you, and I would rather they not find you on my land after dark with nothing but a lamp between us and trouble. He stayed. He slept in the barn beside the horses, on a bedroll she gave him without comment, and in the morning she found him already up and mending the section of fence she had abandoned when the storm hit, working with his good arm and wincing only a little, and something about the sight of him there, unasked, doing a thing that needed doing simply because it needed doing, settled into her chest and stayed there for the rest of the day. He left after breakfast, riding a wide loop around toward Larkspur that avoided the main trail, and promised to send word if he learned anything more about Castellan's dealings. And Susanna Gentry watched him go and told herself firmly that she was not going to make the mistake of hoping for a man's return, not after burying one husband already, not with a fight like the one in front of her demanding every ounce of her attention. She told herself that for 3 days, and on the 4th day, when a rider came up her lane at a canter, her heart leapt before her mind had finished deciding whether that was foolish. It was not Elias Archer. It was a boy from Larkspur, 12 years old and terrified, sent by the county recorder's clerk, who happened to be the boy's uncle and who happened to have a conscience that outweighed his fear of Roy Castellan by a narrow margin. The boy delivered a single folded paper into Susanna's hand, and then turned his horse and rode off again without waiting to be thanked, as though the errand itself had frightened him more than any storm. The paper was a notice, typed on the recorder's own letterhead, stating that a hearing would be held in Larkspur on the 14th day of November, before Judge Prentice Cole, riding circuit from Denver, to determine final disposition of the property known as the Gentry homestead, based upon a bill of sale presented by the Castellan Mining Company. Susanna read it twice, standing in her own yard with the dust of the boy's departure still hanging in the air, and felt something in her go cold and then, just as quickly, go hard and clear, like water freezing into something with an edge. The 14th of November was 11 days away. She rode into Larkspur herself that same afternoon, not waiting for Elias Archer or anyone else, because the land was hers and the fight was hers, and she had never in her life been a woman who waited for someone else to hold up a roof that was falling on her own head. Larkspur in late October had the frantic, overstuffed energy of a town racing the calendar, wagons loaded with winter supplies queued 3 deep outside the mercantile, miners buying extra lamp oil and salt pork before the high passes closed for the season, and under all of it, the particular electric tension of a boomtown that had grown faster than its own laws could keep pace with, where a man with enough silver money could still, in 1881, buy himself a judge's patience if not his verdict. She went first to the recorder's office, a narrow clapboard building squeezed between the assay office and a milliner's shop, and found the clerk, the same uncle who had sent his nephew to warn her, a thin, nervous man named Otis Pratt who would not quite meet her eyes. "Mrs. Gentry, I am sorry, I truly am, but the filing came through proper channels, with a witness signature and all, and I have no legal grounds to set it aside without a judge's say." "A witnessed signature by whom, Mr. Pratt?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation she saw the whole shape of the thing. "By one of Mr. Castellan's own foremen, ma'am, a man named Dobbs. My husband could not lift a pen the month that bill of sale claims he signed it, Mr. Pratt. I nursed him myself. I know exactly what he could and could not do, because I was there and Roy Castellan's foreman was not." Otis Pratt's hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers he did not need to shuffle. "I believe you, Mrs. Gentry. I do. But belief is not evidence a judge will weigh, and I have a family to feed, and Mr. Castellan is not a forgiving man toward clerks who make trouble for him." She left the recorder's office with nothing but the certainty that the law, as written on paper in this town, was not going to save her, and that whatever saved her would have to be built by her own hands, the same way the homestead had been. She found Elias Archer that evening at Ruth Halloran's small rented room above the mercantile, where he had gone to check the healing fever, and she suspected from the careful way he greeted her, to think through the exact same tangle of trouble she had spent the day chewing on. Ruth Halloran was a thin, dark-haired woman perhaps 5 years older than Susanna, with the particular exhausted alertness of someone who had been frightened for a long time and had learned to keep functioning anyway. "Mrs. Gentry," Elias said, and something in his face eased when he saw her, relief plain enough that she felt it land somewhere warm beneath her ribs despite the day she'd had. "I was going to ride out to you tomorrow. There is more to tell." "There is more for me to tell too," she said, and laid the recorder's notice on the small table between them. "11 days, Dr. Archer. Judge Prentice Cole is coming from Denver to decide whether I still own the roof over my head." Ruth Halloran leaned forward to read the notice, and her face went pale and then furious in quick succession. "That is the same judge," she said. "The same judge is set to hear my complaint against Castellan's foreman the day after yours. Cole is well regarded in Denver, Mrs. Gentry, a fair man by reputation, not one of Castellan's bought men so far as anyone knows, but fair only matters if the evidence reaches him whole. Castellan does not need to buy the judge if he can simply make sure the witnesses never arrive to testify." The room went quiet. Outside, Larkspur's evening traffic rattled past, wagons and horses and the general clamor of a town racing the coming winter, entirely indifferent to the 3 people in a small upstairs room who had just understood altogether the true shape of the danger closing in. "They already tried for me on the trail," Elias said quietly. "They will try again for me, for Ruth, and I think now, for you too, Mrs. Gentry, the moment Castellan understands you mean to fight this in front of Judge Cole instead of simply losing your land quiet and going somewhere else." "I have nowhere else to go," Susanna said. "This is not simply land, Dr. Archer. It is 4 years of my life and Nathaniel's. It is the well we dug together with our own hands the summer of the drought. It is the orchard trees I planted the year we married that are only now old enough to bear apples. I built that homestead. I am not walking away from it because a man with more silver than sense has decided he wants what is under the ridge more than he cares who he has to lynch or forge or frighten to get it. Elias Archer looked at her, this woman he had known for exactly 4 days, and felt the old restlessness in him, the thing that had kept him riding a wide, lonely circuit for 11 years, go strangely quiet in her presence, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to purpose. "Then we had better make sure," he said, "that all 3 of us are standing in front of Judge Cole on the 14th alive, with the truth in our hands instead of just our word." Ruth Halloran looked between the 2 of them, doctor and widow, and something in her tired face softened despite the danger pressing in around all 3 of them. "There is a way," she said slowly. "My husband kept a ledger before he died of every dollar he ever paid Castellan's company for equipment and every claim he ever filed. If that ledger still exists, and if it shows the dates properly, it would prove he was solvent and had no debt requiring a sale of his claim at the time Castellan says he signed it. The trouble is, the ledger is not here. It is at my old cabin, 2 days' ride northeast, up past Cascade Creek, in country Castellan's men know less well than they know the main roads, because it was never worth their trouble to go there until now." "Then we go and get it," Susanna said, before she had entirely finished thinking the sentence through, and found that she meant it. Elias looked at her for a long moment, weighing the danger of the ride against the danger of doing nothing, and found, to his own faint surprise, that he had already decided the same thing. 2 days up, likely 1 day back if the weather holds," he said. "We would need to leave within the week to make the hearing with time to spare. I know the country past Cascade Creek tolerably well from my rounds. There is a narrow canyon trail that cuts the distance by half a day, though it is not a route most riders would choose, since it is tight enough in places that a man leading a pack horse has to go single file, and it dead ends into a rock fall about 2/3 through unless you know the old miner's cutoff that goes up and over instead of through." "You know it then," Susanna said. "I have ridden it twice. Once in daylight, once, regrettably, in the dark, on a call to a berthing that could not wait for morning." He allowed himself a small, tired smile. "I would rather ride it in daylight this time, if the choice is mine." Ruth Halloran drew a rough map on the back of the recorder's notice, marking the cabin, the creek, the canyon trail, while outside the window Larkspur's lamps came up one by one against the gathering dark, and 3 people who had been strangers a week before bent their heads together over a scrap of paper, building, without quite naming it yet, the shape of a shared fight. They left Larkspur 2 mornings later, before first light, Susanna on her own sturdy mare, and Elias on the bay gelding whose shoulder had long since healed clean under her own careful stitching, both of them dressed warm against the November cold that had begun creeping down off the peaks in earnest. Ruth Halloran stayed behind in Larkspur, too weak yet from her fever to make the ride, tasked instead with quietly gathering what allies she could among the townsfolk who resented Castellan's growing grip on the valley, a schoolteacher here, a shopkeeper there, small threads that might, woven together, hold something up when the time came. The first day's ride took Susanna and Elias up out of the valley and into foothill country, turning gold and rust, with the last of autumn, aspen groves shedding leaves in slow gusts, the air sharp enough to sting at the edges of the lungs. They talked as they rode, the easy, unhurried talk of 2 people with nothing but miles ahead of them and no reason left to guard every word. "Tell me about him," Susanna said at one point, when the trail widened enough to ride abreast. "Your life before you were the doctor who rides between 4 camps and sleeps more nights in a saddle than a bed. You are not from Colorado originally, I would guess, by the way you say certain words." "Philadelphia," Elias admitted. "I trained there at a proper medical college, with proper professors who believed medicine belonged in a clean office with clean linens and patients who arrived by carriage, instead of on the back of a mule with a broken leg wrapped in someone's shirt. I came west after the war. I had been a surgeon's assistant in a field hospital for 2 years, and I found when it was over that I could not go back to Philadelphia and treat gout and headaches in wealthy men who complained about their dinners. I needed the country to be as wide and rough as what I had seen. Colorado gave me that, and it has kept you riding 11 years. It has. Long enough that I stopped keeping close count of the years and started only keeping count of the camps. Larkspur, Cascade, Bitter Creek, the Anderson Claim, around and around, the same circuit, different faces each season as the camps grow or empty out. I have delivered babies who are near grown men now. I have set the same broken bones twice on men too stubborn to stay off a horse while they healed. It is a good life, Mrs. Gentry. It has simply been, until recently, a very lonely one, though I did not let myself notice that particular truth very often, since noticing it did not change anything I could do about it. Susanna glanced sideways at him, at the steady set of his jaw, the tiredness around his eyes that spoke of more sleepless nights than any one man ought to carry alone. "And has something changed?" she asked carefully. "That makes you notice it now." He was quiet for a moment, the horse's hooves ringing soft against the stony trail, aspen leaves ticking down around them in the cold, bright air. "I believe it might have," he said finally, and did not elaborate further, and Susanna found that she did not need him to, because the warmth that rose in her own chest at his answer told her everything the words themselves had left unsaid. They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow beside a stream, a small fire built low against the cold and against the risk of being seen from any distance, and ate a simple supper of dried meat and hard bread, sitting close to the flames with a single wool blanket shared between them for warmth once the temperature dropped hard after dark. "Tell me about Nathaniel," Elias said, gently, watching the firelight move across her face. "You do not have to. But I would like to know the man whose homestead you are fighting so hard to keep whole." Susanna was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, the voice of a woman who had grieved thoroughly and come out the other side of it still standing. He was a quiet man, not much given to big talk or big plans, but the kind of steady that a person does not always appreciate until it is gone. "We came out from Missouri together, 5 years back, married only a few months before we left, and we built that homestead with our own hands, the two of us, stone by stone and log by log. He got sick the 3rd winter, a cough that would not leave, and it turned into consumption, and I watched him go from a man who could split a cord of wood in an afternoon to a man who could not walk from the bed to the window without resting twice. I nursed him for the better part of a year before he died. I do not regret a single day of that year, hard as it was, because it taught me exactly how much a person can love another person, even when love does not change the ending. "I am sorry," Elias said quietly, "for your loss and for the fight this valley has forced on you since. I am not looking for pity, Dr. Archer. I am not offering pity. I am offering the plain truth that you deserved better than what Roy Castellan is trying to do to you, and I intend to help make sure he does not succeed." He paused, and then added, more quietly still, "And I will admit, since we are being plain with each other tonight, that some part of me is grateful the storm blew me to your door instead of anywhere else, whatever danger came riding along behind me. I have not felt this alive in a long while, Susanna Gentry, and I do not think it is only the fight that has done it." She looked at him across the small fire, this careful, steady, deeply tired man who had ridden 11 years of lonely circuit and had somehow, in the space of a week, become the person she trusted most in a valley full of danger, and felt her own guarded heart give way, just slightly, just enough to let hope back in. "I have not felt very alive myself in some time," she admitted. Grief has a way of making a person go quiet inside, even when the outside keeps moving, keeps fencing and planting and fighting for what is theirs. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to want something for myself again, instead of simply enduring for the sake of what was already built. She hesitated, then added softer, "I am glad it was you the storm brought." Neither of them said more than that night, but when the cold deepened past midnight and Elias fed the last of the wood onto the fire, Susanna did not move away when he settled the shared blanket more securely over both their shoulders, and they sat together in silence, watching the flames, closer than strangers had any right to sit, and neither one of them minded it in the least. They reached Ruth Halloran's abandoned cabin the following afternoon, a small, weathered structure tucked into a fold of hillside above Cascade Creek, and found the ledger exactly where Ruth had said it would be, in a tin box buried beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth. Susanna opened it with careful hands and felt her pulse quicken at what she found. Page after page of dates and figures in a careful, precise hand, showing Ruth's husband's dealings with Castellan's mining company stretching back 3 years. And crucially, a final entry dated only 5 weeks before his death, showing his account fully paid, no debt outstanding, directly contradicting the forged bill of sales claim that he had owed Castellan money requiring the transfer of his claim. "This is it," Susanna breathed. "This is exactly what Ruth needs. And it may help you as well," Elias said, flipping carefully through the earlier pages. "Look here. Castellan's company purchased survey equipment from Ruth's husband the same season your husband filed his own claim, according to the dates Ruth mentioned to me before we left Larkspur. If the company's own ledger of purchases lines up with the timeline you know to be true for Nathaniel, that is a second thread of evidence, separate from your own testimony, showing the pattern of Castellan's company falsifying records when it suits them." Susanna closed the ledger carefully and held it against her chest for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the strange, fragile hope contained in a few dozen pages of careful handwriting. "We should start back at first light," she said. "The hearing is 8 days off now, and I do not want to cut the return any closer than we must." They banked the cabin's cold hearth, secured the ledger deep in Elias' saddlebag wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, and made camp that night just outside the cabin, close enough to shelter if the cold turned sharp. And it was there, over a second night's small fire, that Elias Archer finally told Susanna Gentry the rest of what he had learned in Larkspur while she had been readying for the ride north. "Castellan has placed a bounty," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes at first, as though the words cost him something to say aloud. $200, offered quiet, through men who owe him favors, for anyone who can make certain you do not testify at the hearing on the 14th. I did not want to tell you before we left Larkspur, because I feared you would not go for the ledger if you knew, and we needed that ledger too badly to risk you staying behind out of fear for my sake or your own." Susanna went very still. "You should have told me," she said, but there was no real anger in it, only a kind of raw, frightened honesty. "I have a right to know what price has been put on my own life, Dr. Archer, even if the knowing changes nothing about what I mean to do. You are right. I am sorry. I have spent 11 years protecting people by managing what they knew and did not know, deciding for them what fear they could bear, and it is a poor habit in a man who claims to respect a woman's judgment. I will not do it again." He met her eyes now, steady despite the admission. $200, Susanna. That is enough to tempt desperate men, and this valley has no shortage of those. We should assume from here to Larkspur that we are being watched, or will be soon." Susanna nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it, and found, beneath the fear, a hard, clear anger rising to meet it. "Then let them come," she said. "I did not ride 2 days into the mountains and back for a ledger just to hand my life over cheap to whichever desperate man wants to collect Castellan's silver. I would rather die standing on my own land than live quiet somewhere else, because I was too frightened to fight for what is mine." Elias looked at her in the firelight, fierce and unbowed, and felt something in his chest turn over completely, the last of his careful distance giving way to something he could no longer pretend was simply professional concern. "I do not intend to let it come to dying," he said quietly. "Not yours and not, if I have any say in the matter, mine either. But I want you to know, Susanna Gentry, whatever happens between here and Larkspur, I'm not leaving your side until that ledger is in Judge Cole's hands and your name is on your own deed, signed and recorded, beyond anyone's power to steal it from you again. Even if it costs you your circuit, your patience, the life you have built these 11 years. Even then, some things are worth more than a habit of riding alone." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers, and she did not pull away. "I told you, back at your kitchen table that first night, that I had not felt this alive in a long while. I want the chance to keep feeling it, Susanna. I want the chance to see what we might build, you and I, once this fight is finished and the danger has passed. If you would have me." Susanna Gentry looked at their joined hands in the firelight, at this steady, devoted man who had ridden into her life on the edge of a storm and had not once in the days since asked her to be smaller or safer or quieter than she already was, and felt the last of her careful, grief-guarded walls come down entirely. "I would have you," she said softly. "Once this is finished, I would have you gladly." He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished it, and when she did not, he kissed her, gentle and certain, there beside the small fire with the whole cold mountain night wrapped around them. And Susanna Gentry kissed him back with a fierceness that surprised them both, two lonely, capable people finding, at last, in the middle of a dangerous fight neither had asked for, exactly the kind of belonging neither had dared to hope for again. They broke camp before dawn, the ledger secure, the promise between them new and fragile and fiercely held, and rode south and east through country going gray with the season's first hard frost, unaware that Roy Castellan's men had already found their trail 2 days behind and were closing the distance with grim, professional patience. The canyon came upon them on the second day of the return ride, a narrow defile Elias had chosen deliberately to save time, its walls rising sheer and rust-colored on either side of a trail, barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, the creek that had carved it running low and silver along the bottom. They were perhaps a third of the way through when Elias bay gelding threw its head up sharply, ears pinned, and Susanna's own mare shied at nearly the same moment, both animals reading danger before either rider had heard a single sound. The first shot came from above and behind, cracking off the canyon wall in a way that made the direction impossible to pin down at first, throwing chips of red rock into the air not 6 feet from Susanna's mare. "Ride!" Elias shouted, already turning his own horse deeper into the canyon rather than back the way they had come, and Susanna did not question him, only pressed her heels into her mare's sides and followed, her heart slamming against her ribs as a second shot and then a third chased them down the narrow throat of stone. "How many?" she called over the wind and the drumming hooves. "3, maybe 4, I could not count clean," Elias called back. "They are above us on the east rim, which means they cannot easily get ahead of us unless they know a way down, and I do not believe they do, because this whole valley belongs to men who chase silver on the surface roads and never learn the country beneath their own feet." The canyon narrowed further, the walls pressing close enough that Susanna could have reached out and touched red stone on either side, and ahead of them she saw exactly what Elias had described in Larkspur, a great tumble of fallen rock choking the main channel entirely, a dead end for anyone who did not know the way around it. "There," Elias called, pointing to a narrow cleft in the western wall, barely wide enough for a single horse, half hidden behind a stand of scrub cedar. "The miner's cutoff. It climbs steep for about 100 yards and then levels onto the rim itself. Castellan's men will not know it is there unless they have ridden this canyon before, and I would wager good money they have not." They reached the rock fall with the gunmen's shots still cracking behind them, closer now, one bullet striking sparks off stone barely a yard from Elias' stirrup, and Susanna felt a cold spike of pure fear pierce through the adrenaline, fear not for herself but for him, riding exposed on the outside of the trail while she had the shelter of the canyon wall. "Get to the cleft," he shouted, and reined his horse around hard, putting himself deliberately between Susanna and the direction of the gunfire. "Elias, no. Go, Susanna, now. I am right behind you, I promise you that." She went, because there was no time left to argue, driving her mare hard up the narrow cleft, loose rock skittering beneath the horse's hooves, branches of cedar scratching at her arms and face, and behind her she heard Elias' horse scrambling up the same narrow track, close enough that she could hear his ragged breathing over the drumming of hooves and her own thundering pulse. They broke out onto the canyon rim into open, wind-scoured country, the sun low and orange over the western peaks, and below them, through gaps in the rock, Susanna could see 3 riders milling in confusion at the base of the rock fall, realizing too late that their quarry had simply vanished from a canyon they had believed to be a dead end. "They do not know the cutoff," Elias said, breathing hard, reining his horse up beside hers on the open rim. "We have bought ourselves real distance now, if we push on before they think to search the walls for another way up. Are you hit?" Susanna asked, her voice raw with fear only now catching up to her, taking in the sight of him, upright, alive, unhurt. "No, you." "No," she let out a shaking breath, half laugh, half sob, the terror of the last 5 minutes draining out of her all at once. "You put yourself between me and their guns, Elias Archer. You could have been killed." "I know precisely what I did," he said, reaching over to take her hand where it gripped the reins, steadying her, steadying himself in the same motion. "I would do it again without a moment's hesitation, Susanna. I told you I meant to stay by your side through this. I am not a man who says such a thing lightly." She looked at him, wind-blown and pale with the aftermath of danger, and felt her fear transform in the space of a breath into something fiercer and more certain than she had expected to feel again in her lifetime. "Then let us not waste the distance they have given us," she said. "Larkspur is still 3 days off, and I mean to reach it with both of us breathing and that ledger dry in your saddlebag." They pushed hard for the rest of that day and camped cold that night. No fire this time, huddled together beneath every blanket they carried for warmth and for the simple, fierce comfort of being close after nearly losing each other. And in the morning they rode on, wary now, choosing high open ground where they could see any pursuit coming from a distance, and Castellan's 3 riders did not find their trail again. It was on the second night of that final stretch, camped in a sheltered stand of pine with a small fire finally risked, once they judged themselves safely ahead of pursuit, that Susanna Gentry found herself watching Elias Archer clean the day's dust from his medical bag with the same careful, unhurried attention he gave to everything, and felt a rush of tenderness so sudden and complete that it nearly took her breath. "You take better care of that bag than most men take of their own horses," she observed, settling beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "This bag has saved more lives than any horse I have owned," he said, accepting the cup with a small, grateful smile. "Though I will grant you, the horses have saved my life a fair number of times too, including twice this week alone." "Tell me something," Susanna said, watching the firelight play across the sharp planes of his face. 11 years riding a circuit between 4 camps, no home of your own, no wife, no family waiting anywhere. Was there never a woman along the way who made you want to stop?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything before answering. "There was a woman in Cascade, some years back, a schoolteacher, kind and clever, and I believe if I had asked her, she might have said yes to marrying me. But I did not ask, because I could not imagine asking any woman to build a life around a man who was gone 3 weeks out of every 4, riding to other people's emergencies, while his own house sat cold and empty. It did not seem a fair thing to offer anyone. So I told myself the circuit was my life, and I stopped looking for anything more, and I believed that quite thoroughly, right up until a dust storm blew me into your barn and you handed me a needle and thread and told me to hold still." Susanna laughed softly, surprised into it. "I did tell you to hold still. You were a terrible patient. Worse than the Kellerman boy, and you did not even have the excuse of being 9 years old. I have been informed of this failing before, he said solemnly, though never quite so directly. What changed then, between that first night and now? You do not strike me as a man who abandons a settled conviction easily. He set down his coffee and looked at her seriously, the humor fading into something quieter, more honest. You did not need saving, Susanna. That is the truth of it. I have spent 11 years riding to people who needed something from me. A broken bone set, a fever broken, a child brought safely into the world. And I gave what I had to give and rode on because there was always another camp, another patient, another need. But you did not need me to save you. You needed a witness and an ally and perhaps, if I am honest, someone to ride beside you instead of someone to ride to your rescue. That is a different thing entirely, and I did not realize until I had ridden 3 days at your side exactly how much I had been missing it. You made me want, for the first time in a very long while, to be somewhere instead of merely riding toward it. Susanna reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, feeling the roughness of a working man's palm against her own work-hardened skin. "Then stop riding, Elias," she said softly. "Not the circuit entirely. I know too well how many people need you scattered across these mountains. But stop riding away from any place that might be home. Build one with me, once this fight is behind us. I have a homestead that needs a name properly recorded on its deed, and a porch that could use 2 rocking chairs instead of 1 gathering dust, and I find I would very much like one of those chairs to be yours." He turned her hand over in his and pressed a kiss to her palm, slow and reverent. And when he looked up at her, his eyes were bright with something that looked very much like the beginning of a whole new life. "Susanna Gentry," he said, "I believe that is the finest offer I have received in 11 years of riding, and I intend to accept it with my whole heart. The moment we have finished making certain no one can take that homestead, or your good name, away from you." They reached Larkspur on the morning of the 13th of November, 1 day ahead of the hearing, having ridden the last stretch through a thin, cold rain that turned the road to churned mud and left both of them soaked through and exhausted but whole. Ruth Halloran met them at the edge of town, her face taut with worry that broke into open relief the moment she saw them crest the rise. "I was beginning to fear the worst," she said, embracing Susanna briefly before turning to Elias. "There has been talk in town. Castellan knows you went north. His men rode back in yesterday empty-handed and furious, and he has been closeted with his lawyer since dawn." "Then he knows we survived, and he knows we are close," Elias said, "which means we have very little time before he tries something more direct than an ambush in a canyon." They rode into Larkspur proper with the ledger still wrapped safe in Elias' saddlebag, and it was there, dismounting outside the small hotel where Ruth had arranged rooms, that they found Roy Castellan himself waiting on the boardwalk, flanked by 2 of his men, his silver-headed cane tapping an idle, unhurried rhythm against the planks. He was a compact man, silver-haired despite being no older than 50, dressed in a fine wool coat that looked entirely out of place against Larkspur's mud and rough timber, and his eyes, when they settled on Susanna, held the particular cold calculation of a man used to purchasing whatever he could not simply take. "Mrs. Gentry," he said with a small, unpleasant smile, "I had heard you were traveling. I do hope the journey was pleasant." "It was educational, Mr. Castellan," Susanna said, meeting his gaze without flinching, though her heart hammered hard beneath her calm exterior. "I learned a great deal about the value of a well-kept ledger." Something flickered across Castellan's face, there and gone too quickly to name, but Elias, watching closely, saw it, and knew in that instant that the man understood exactly what they had ridden north to find. "A woman ought to be careful," Castellan said softly, "about what she goes looking for in these mountains. It is dangerous country. Storms, wild animals, unfortunate accidents. A man might warn a friend to stay closer to home, for her own protection." "I have found," Susanna said, That the greatest danger in this valley these past months has not been storms or wild animals, Mr. Castellan. It has been men who believe they can steal a widow's home out from under her with a forged signature and a frightened clerk. I intend to see that particular danger addressed in front of Judge Cole tomorrow, at the appointed hour, and I would advise you not to trouble yourself with any further warnings on my behalf. Castellan's smile thinned into something considerably less pleasant, and his cane stopped its idle tapping. You are a bold woman, Mrs. Gentry. Boldness in a woman is not always a survivable quality out here. Neither is greed in a man, Mr. Castellan, Elias said quietly, stepping half a pace forward, his voice carrying an edge Susanna had not heard in it before, when it runs up against people who refuse to be frightened off their own land. I would advise you to spend tonight preparing your own defense before Judge Cole rather than issuing threats on a public boardwalk in front of witnesses. Castellan's gaze cut to Elias, taking in, perhaps for the first time, the full measure of the doctor's steady, unyielding presence, and something calculating shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation of risk against reward. "Dr. Archer," he said slowly, "I had heard you took an interest in Mrs. Halloran's little grievance. I had not realized it extended quite this far." "It extends exactly as far as the truth requires it to," Elias said. "No further and no less." Castellan held his gaze a moment longer, then gave a short, humorless laugh and stepped back, tapping his cane once against the boardwalk as though closing a ledger of his own. "Tomorrow, then," he said. "We shall see what Judge Cole makes of your truth, Dr. Archer. Good evening." He walked away down the boardwalk with his two men falling in behind him, and Susanna let out a long, shaking breath she had not realized she was holding. "That man means to try something before tomorrow," she said quietly. "He would not have shown himself so plainly otherwise. He is worried, and worried men act." "Then we do not let anyone out of sight tonight," Elias said. "Ruth, is there somewhere safer than the hotel we might all gather until morning? Somewhere with more eyes and fewer easy approaches?" "The church," Ruth said. "Reverend Whitfield has no love for Castellan, not since the man tried to buy the church bell tower lot out from under the congregation last spring. He will give us shelter for the night and ask no dangerous questions." They spent that final night before the hearing in the small church at the edge of Larkspur, Reverend Whitfield posting his own teenage son as a lookout at the door with a shotgun he plainly had no intention of using unless forced to. And the four of them, Susanna, Elias, Ruth, and the nervous but resolute Otis Pratt, who had slipped away from the recorder's office to join them once darkness fell, spent the hours going over every piece of evidence they carried, arranging it, strengthening it, preparing for the fight that dawn would bring. Susanna sat close beside Elias through most of that long night, their shoulders touching, his hand finding hers in quiet moments between the practical work of preparing testimony, and in the gray hour just before dawn, when the others had finally fallen into exhausted, fitful sleep along the church pews, the two of them sat alone together near a single guttering candle, and Susanna found herself studying his tired, steady face with a fullness of feeling she had not expected to carry into a moment so fraught with danger. "Whatever happens today," she said softly, "I want you to know that riding north with you, canyon ambush and all, has been the truest thing I have felt in 2 years. I do not say that lightly, Elias. I do not take it lightly," he said, turning to face her fully, his hand coming up to gently brush a loose strand of hair back from her face. "Susanna, whatever Judge Cole decides today about the land about Castellan, I want you to know my offer from the mountainside stands unchanged. I intend to stop riding away from you, whatever the ruling. I love you. I do not believe I have ever said those words to a woman and meant them so entirely." "I love you too, Elias Archer," she whispered, and the words felt like a door opening onto a whole life neither of them had dared imagine 2 weeks before. "Whatever the sun brings today, I want to build something with you after. A home. A real one with 2 names on the deed instead of one, if you would have that, once this fight is behind us." "I would have nothing more," he said, and kissed her softly there in the candle-lit church, gentle and full of promise, while outside the sky began slowly to lighten toward the dawn of the day that would decide everything. Judge Prentice Cole held court that afternoon in Larkspur's largest available space, the schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, its rough benches filled nearly to capacity with townsfolk drawn by curiosity, and in no small number, by quiet sympathy for a widow fighting a mining company that had grown too large and too careless with other people's lives. Judge Cole himself was a lean, gray-bearded man of perhaps 60, with sharp, tired eyes that missed very little, and he called the Gentry matter first on his docket, ahead even of Ruth Halloran's complaint, once he understood the two cases were entangled. Roy Castellan sat at the front of the room with his lawyer, a slick, city-dressed man named Vance who had ridden up from Denver for the occasion, and Susanna sat opposite them with Elias close beside her, Ruth Halloran and Otis Pratt seated just behind, the ledger and the recorder's own filing records laid out carefully on the table before them. The lawyer Vance spoke first, smooth and confident, presenting the bill of sale as a legitimate transaction, properly witnessed, properly filed. And for a long, sick moment Susanna felt the old fear rise in her chest, the fear of a system built to favor exactly the kind of man sitting across the aisle from her. Then Judge Cole turned to her and said, in a voice that carried no particular warmth but also no particular hostility, simply patient, professional attention, "Mrs. Gentry, you have requested to be heard. Proceed." Susanna Gentry rose to her feet, smoothed her skirt with hands that did not shake despite everything her body wanted to do, and told the truth, plainly, without embellishment, exactly as she had told it to Elias that first night over coffee. Her husband's illness, his physical incapacity in the months the bill of sale claimed he had signed it, the sudden appearance of the document only after his death, the recorder's office that had somehow lost her repeated requests to correct the deed, to include her own name despite her equal claim on land she had built with her own 2 hands. Then she called Dr. Elias Archer, and he stood and confirmed, from his own medical knowledge and his own examination of Nathaniel Gentry during the final months of his illness the year before, that the man had been physically incapable of the steady, controlled signature shown on the disputed bill of sale, his hands too weakened by advanced consumption to hold a pen with any firmness at all. Then Ruth Halloran presented her ledger, page by careful page, showing her own husband's dealings with Castellan's company, the timeline of purchases and payments that, when laid alongside the county recorder's own filing dates, revealed a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. 3 separate claims in 3 separate years, each transferred to Castellan's company by bill of sale filed only after the claim holder's death, each witnessed by the same foreman, a man named Dobbs who, Otis Pratt now testified with visibly shaking hands, had been instructed by Castellan himself to backdate and forge the necessary signatures whenever a claim holder died before Castellan could complete a purchase. Through legitimate means. The courtroom had gone very still by the time Otis Pratt finished speaking, and Judge Cole's sharp eyes had settled on Roy Castellan with an expression that no longer held any trace of patient neutrality. "Mr. Castellan," the judge said, "your lawyer is welcome to respond, but I will tell you plainly that a pattern of 3 forged transfers, corroborated by an independent ledger, a treating physician's testimony, and a recorder's clerk willing to risk his own livelihood to speak the truth, is not a pattern I am prepared to overlook in favor of a single disputed document." Vance rose to object, to argue procedure, to demand time to review the ledger's authenticity, but the room's mood had shifted decisively, and even Castellan seemed to understand it, sitting rigid and pale in his fine wool coat, while the weight of the evidence settled around him like a closing net. Judge Cole ruled before the afternoon was out. The bill of sale purporting to transfer the Gentry homestead was declared void, the product of fraud, and the deed was ordered corrected to reflect joint ownership as it should have been recorded from the beginning, with instructions that Susanna Gentry's name be entered upon it without further delay or obstruction. Ruth Halloran's claim was similarly vindicated, her husband's mining property restored to her name, and Judge Cole further ordered that the matter of Roy Castellan's foreman and the broader question of Castellan's own knowledge and direction of the fraud be referred to the territorial prosecutor in Denver for formal criminal investigation, a process that would take months to resolve, but that stripped Castellan, that same afternoon, of any further standing to threaten either woman's land or safety while it proceeded. Castellan left the schoolhouse that day a diminished man, his lawyer already distancing himself from a client now facing serious legal exposure. And though Susanna knew the coming months would bring further hearings, further paperwork, further careful vigilance to see the matter fully closed, she felt, walking out of that schoolhouse into the cold, clear light of a Colorado November afternoon with Elias Archer's hand warm around hers, that the heart of the danger had finally, truly broken. The formal signing took place 3 days later, back at the county recorder's office, with Otis Pratt, newly emboldened and no longer looking over his shoulder quite so anxiously, laying out the corrected deed on his desk with something almost like pride. Susanna Gentry stood before it in the last golden light of a late autumn afternoon, the sun sitting low and orange over the western ridge, exactly the way it had the evening the storm first blew Elias Archer into her barn, and picked up the pen with a hand that trembled, finally, not with fear, but with the sheer overwhelming weight of relief. She signed her name, Susanna Gentry, clear and steady beneath Nathaniel's name already recorded above it, both of them now properly, permanently, the rightful owners of the land they had built together. And beside her, Elias Archer signed as witness, his own hand steady beside hers, and when the pen finally lifted from the paper, Otis Pratt pressed the recorder's seal to the corner of the page with a solemn, satisfied thump, and it was done. The homestead was hers, beyond any further question, beyond any further forged paper or hired gun or desperate man's greed. "It is finished," she said softly, staring at her own name on the page, feeling 2 years of grief and struggle and lonely fear finally settle into something like peace. "One thing is finished," Elias said, close beside her, his voice warm with a promise she recognized now as entirely her own to claim. "I believe another thing is only just beginning if you are still of a mind to have me on that porch of yours, Susanna Gentry." She turned to him, the low sun catching gold in his eyes, and felt her heart fill entirely with the kind of certain, steady joy she had not allowed herself to imagine feeling again after Nathaniel's death, a joy that did not erase her grief but stood alongside it, another true thing in a life that had room, she was learning, for more than one kind of love. "I am entirely of a mind," she said, "though I should warn you, Dr. Archer, that a homestead comes with considerable work. Fences to mend, an orchard to tend, a well that needs deepening before next summer's drought. I do not intend to marry a man simply to have him sit idle on a porch admiring the view." "I would not dream of sitting idle," he said, laughing, pulling her close despite Otis Pratt's polite, determined focus on his own paperwork just a few feet away. "Though I will admit, I intend to keep my circuit too, at least in part. There are people scattered across 4 camps who have come to rely on me, and I cannot in good conscience abandon them entirely, even for the finest homestead and the finest woman in this valley." "I would never ask you to," Susanna said. "I fell in love with a man who rides toward people who need him, Elias. I would not ask you to become someone else entirely. I only ask that when the riding is done, you ride home to me, instead of simply to the next camp on the circuit. That," Elias said softly, "I can promise without a single moment's hesitation." They were married 2 weeks later, on a cold, bright December morning, in the same small church that had sheltered them the night before the hearing, Reverend Whitfield presiding with evident satisfaction, Ruth Halloran standing beside Susanna in place of the family she no longer had nearby, and a fair portion of Larkspur's population crowded into the pews, drawn as much by genuine affection for the widow who had refused to be cheated out of her land as by simple curiosity about the doctor who had, against 11 years of solitary habit, finally settled somewhere. Susanna wore a simple dress of deep blue wool, practical against the December cold, with a small spray of dried autumn flowers pinned at her collar that she had gathered herself from the last of the season's growth along her own fence line. And when Elias Archer turned to watch her walk the short aisle toward him, the look on his face was one of such open, unguarded wonder that half the women in the church found themselves reaching for handkerchiefs despite their best efforts at composure. "I, Elias Archer, take you, Susanna Gentry," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion playing beneath it, "to be my wife, my partner, and my home from this day forward, in sickness and in health, in danger and in peace, for as long as we both shall live." "I, Susanna Gentry, take you, Elias Archer," she answered, her own voice clear and sure, "to be my husband, my equal, and my belonging from this day forward. I have built one home already with my own 2 hands, and I find I am glad, more glad than I have words for, to build a second one now, with yours beside mine." They exchanged the plain gold bands Elias had purchased in Denver on a brief errand the week before, and when Reverend Whitfield pronounced them married, the small church erupted into genuine, warm applause, and outside, as they emerged into the cold, bright noon together, husband and wife, someone had strung a rough garland of evergreen boughs over the church door in celebration, and the whole town of Larkspur seemed, for one bright winter afternoon, to share in the particular joy of watching 2 people who had each known too much loneliness finally find their way to each other. They rode out to the homestead together that same afternoon, the wedding party trailing behind in a loose, cheerful caravan of wagons and horses for the small celebration Susanna had insisted on hosting in her own yard despite the cold. And as the sun began its long slide toward the western ridge, painting the sky in the same rich orange and gold it had worn the evening Elias first stumbled bleeding into her barn, Susanna stood on her own porch, her husband's arm warm around her shoulders, and looked out over land that was, at last, entirely, legally, undeniably hers, shared now not out of fear or fraud but out of a love freely chosen by 2 people strong enough to have stood alone and wise enough to choose instead to stand together. "Do you remember," she said softly, watching the sun touch the ridge line, "that first evening when the storm had cleared and I asked you to stay the night in my barn, and you told me you were obliged to me?" "I remember every moment of it," Elias said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I remember thinking, even bleeding and exhausted, that I had never in my life met a woman so entirely unwilling to be frightened out of what was hers." "I am glad the storm brought you," she said. "I am glad, more than I know how to say, that we signed that deed together, and that we signed our own names together today, both at sundown, both with the whole valley watching, and neither of us alone anymore." "Neither of us alone," Elias agreed, turning her gently to face him, the last light of the sun gilding both their faces gold. "You gave me a reason to stop riding away from things, Susanna Gentry Archer. I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never regret it." "I could not possibly regret it," she said, and kissed him there on the porch of the home she had fought so hard to keep, surrounded by the fading golden light and the distant, cheerful sound of their wedding guests, unloading provisions for the evening's celebration. 2 capable, once lonely people who had ridden through storm and ambush and false accusation, and had come out the other side not diminished, but doubled, each one's strength made greater by the other's steady presence. Behind them, the sun finally slipped below the western ridge, and the first cold stars of the Colorado winter night began to show themselves in a sky gone the deep, endless blue of full evening, and Susanna Gentry Archer stood on her own porch, in her own home, beside the man she loved, and felt, for the first time in 2 long years of grief and struggle, entirely, completely safe, entirely, completely home. The following spring, when the mountain passes opened again, and Larkspur's population swelled once more with new arrivals chasing silver dreams. Word traveled through the valley of Roy Castellan's formal indictment in Denver, of his foreman Dobbs turning state's evidence rather than face prison alone, of a mining company that would spend years untangling the fraud its owner had built it upon. And slowly, steadily, the valley settled into something calmer, fairer, less shadowed by one greedy man's reach. Otis Pratt was promoted to full recorder that same spring, a position he filled with newfound courage and a genuine dedication to seeing every deed properly and honestly filed. Ruth Halloran remarried the following year to a kind widowed rancher from Cascade, and remained close friends with Susanna for the rest of both their long lives, the two women bound forever by the fight they had survived together. And on the Gentry Archer homestead, as the neighbors had taken to calling it with evident approval, the orchard Susanna had planted with Nathaniel all those years before bore its finest crop of apples that autumn, and Elias Archer, riding his familiar circuit between Larkspur and the smaller camps scattered through the mountains, always, without exception, no matter how far the riding took him, found his way home by sundown to the porch, the woman, and the life that had finally, after 11 long years of solitary road, given him every reason in the world to stop.